Hi, my name is Alyssa Pengra, and I'm here to present EDL852 Module 12 case study. Okay, so let's get right to the facts of the case. This involves the Lightville Community School District, which has been increasing in population. So it's been decided that they're going to build a new separate building for middle school, grades 6 through 8. Susan Potter was hired to be the new school's principal. An advisory committee was formed, and Susan felt that the committee's first task should be to develop a vision statement for the school. And in meeting with Helen Burke, who was on the committee, Helen shared with Susan that she and the rest of the planning committee would really prefer that Susan just draft up the mission and vision statements herself. And Susan explained she doesn't feel comfortable with that. She really wants it to be a collaborative process that involves all stakeholders, and she doesn't want to make important decisions by herself. The two at that point kind of agreed to disagree and revisit it with the whole committee at the next meeting, which is what they did. Helen recounted her discussion with Susan to the group, and really the general consensus of the committee was to go with Helen's suggestion of having Susan develop a vision statement, and then the committee, determining at that point whether they agree with it or what they felt like needed to be changed. Susan again tried to explain her reasoning for developing these statements together and how she really wanted the process to go, but only one committee member was comfortable agreeing with Susan on that. Ultimately, Helen made a motion that Susan draft those statements and present it to the committee for approval, and the only person who voted against that was Susan herself. After the meeting ended, Helen did express to Susan that she hoped she didn't feel discouraged by what happened, but that the community really expects her to come in and lead. She also expressed her confidence that by the time the committee is finished, that they would have statements that were embraced by all stakeholders in the community. So as far as ethical legal considerations on this, for those first three things, as far as does it contradict an existing law or policy? Has someone been harmed? Is there a breach of contract? I think all of that is an easy no for me. But when I think about ethical and legal considerations in this case, what I think about is that I really see Susan trying her best to engage in ethical leadership and decision making. I think her actions show that she really wants to get everyone working together to develop a collaborative statement for the school that reflects the community's values. I think it shows me that she values collaboration and fairness. She wants everyone's voice to be heard. And I think that she's trying to show respect for others by demonstrating that their thoughts and opinions matter. And I think this is also probably her way of trying to build trust and transparency by having everyone involved rather than just doing it on her own. But I think a key question for her to consider is whether the way that she envisions one would build trust and show respect is the same as her communities. Is she really listening to them? And I think in considering ethical paradigms, one that I would think about is what about the ethic of local community, which says that you really need to consider how your community feels and thinks about a particular issue, because that might lead to some different decisions than what you would do on your own if you weren't considering that vantage point. So for me, the issue amounts to that Susan's philosophy on how to develop mission and vision statements for schools is not matching up with that of the various stakeholders she is trying to accomplish this task with, which is, of course, problematic. So facts of the case, what's known? We have Susan Potter, we know she was just hired to the district. She's new to the district. She came from somewhere outside of there. We have Helen Burke, who is a teacher at the new middle school, and she's also the chair of the advisory committee. Her brother is a school board member. We have Dan Kelby, a PE teacher and advisory committee team member, and he voiced his agreement with Helen to have Susan develop the school's vision statements. And we know that the situation is that they're building a new separate middle school, and this is a highly controversial decision that had a lot of debate and a lot of different thoughts about what they should do, but it was approved by the voters with a slim margin. Place Lightville Community School District, we know it's a rural school district. Over 60% of its residents live on farms. There's currently one K-6 building and one 7-12 building, and they do have an increasing population of about 2% per year. And the degree of recent increase in population was somewhat unanticipated. And the program is, we know it's a public middle school that's being built to house up to 450 6th through 8th graders. As far as the unknowns of the case that are relevant that I think would help in maybe making some decisions is we don't really know anything about Susan Potter's background and experiences. Has she had previous experience developing a mission and vision statements for schools? And what about in a brand new school? Because I think that's a totally different process, or at least a little bit of a different process than a school that's been around for 20 years. And we know she was hired from an outside district, but how different was her previous district from the one that she's currently in? And I think knowing that information would help us understand a little bit more if she's had experiencing developing these statements a certain way and it's gone really well, and so she wants to stick to that process, or on the contrary, maybe she's had some experiences where it didn't go well, and so she's very motivated to do it this certain way to avoid something that didn't go well last time. And then we're given the impression that the thinking of the advisory board are representative of the community at large, but this is definitely implied and not explicit. So we just kind of have to go off of kind of Helen's statement when she says, trust me, this is what the community expects. This is, everyone's going to be okay with this. We kind of just have to go off of that because we don't really know everyone else's perspective. As far as place and program, I feel like we know everything that would be relevant to the case in regards to those factors. So then stakeholders, there's a lot of different stakeholders in this scenario. We have Susan Potter, of course, she's kind of at the center of this dilemma. She's trying to engage in ethical leadership and decision making, but her method for developing those vision and mission statements are pretty directly opposed by her constituency, I would say. She definitely has a stake in the outcome because she's kind of charged with this role of leading this process. The district as a whole, they want the school to be able to develop some statements that are going to align with the district's goals, but then are also representative of the values of that particular school community. The students are affected because ultimately they'll really be the most affected by the direction that the school leadership chooses to go. We have the advisory committee members, and what I think is important here is that I think that they are invested and want to have effective mission and vision statements that reflect their values, but I think where the breakdown is they just don't want to be involved in that initial development phase of the process, especially the way that Susan relays that process, because what Susan proposes is kind of a pretty intensive live action discussion where they're all sharing these different viewpoints, and it does sound a little time intensive and the way that she explains it. And so I think that they just want Susan to take the lead and get the ball rolling on this, but they have expressed that they're more than willing and want to give her their input, and when she presents that draft statement, they'll let her know what they think about it, whether they agree or something needs to be changed. But I think they're just concerned about having limited time, and that if everyone just starts giving their input, a decision will never get made. And then for middle school staff and parents, we kind of have something similar where, again, it's implied that each of these groups would be content to give their input after the statements are drafted rather than beforehand. But they certainly have a stake in it because as middle school staff, they're going to be responsible for implementing that vision and mission statement. And then as parents, that's going to affect the direction of your child's education and the school environment. So you definitely would care about the outcome there. So options and possible consequences. Number one would be take no action, don't make a decision, don't really do anything. Two would be to proceed exactly as the committee wishes, with Susan drafting those statements and then submitting them for approval. I think a third option would be to kind of basically split the difference where, maybe you agree to draft the philosophy statement independently, but then kind of insist on the collaboration that you originally proposed for developing the school's vision statement, or vice versa. I think a fourth option is to seek the committee's input, but in a different way. So instead of that collaborative discussion at the very beginning, like Susan had originally envisioned, I think that you could develop a survey to send out to the advisory board and get their input that way, and then use that input to draft the philosophy and vision statements. And then I think you could also set up some clear parameters that everyone feels comfortable with for having some discussion after they've had a chance to review those draft statements that Susan has created. So pros and cons, the first one of not really doing anything, I think a pro could be maybe it buys you some time, maybe some people change their minds. I think a con is that members of the committee are frustrated because she's not acting on what they've already approved to happen. the option of just doing just as the committee wishes. I think the pro is that the committee's happy and the statements are going to probably be developed pretty quickly. Con would be that they're probably not going to be as reflective of the community's priorities because they were not in on that ground floor development of them. The third option of kind of splitting the difference and drafting one of the statements independently but collaborating on the other one, I think that Susan would feel more comfortable in this process, and she could gain some quality input this way. I think a con is that the committee might feel frustrated and resentful that she's not going along with the approved motion. And I think it could end up feeling like forced collaboration, which would then probably be a waste of time. The last option about getting input in a different way, I think the pro of that is that Susan can still get much of the same input that she was originally seeking, but just in a different way. I think that by doing that, committee members will likely feel that she's making a true attempt to listen to them and to adjust her tactics accordingly. I think a con is that it's possible that committee members could still be frustrated by being asked to complete a survey. I think you can definitely minimize this in the way that you create the survey. So, I think I would keep it short and sweet and to the point and really just ask the key things that you need to know. And I think you do as much, multiple choice as possible. If you do a bunch of wide open, open-ended questions, then I think people still feel very overwhelmed by that. So that's a potential con though. So I think for me, the decision on this one for me is pretty easy, which is that, considering the feedback from all the stakeholders, I believe the best decision is to gain the committee's input, but through a different modality. And I think that Susan can very much still accomplish that ultimate goal of creating vision and mission statements that are reflective of the community's values and priorities if she is willing to be flexible in how that happens. And so I think the ethic of local community needs to be a strong consideration here. I think that really needs to be taken into account in how her community views things and what they need from her. And I think that you have to adapt your leadership style to the environment and needs of the organization. So for me, if this were me, this next steps I would take is at that next meeting, I would let the committee members know that I have heard what they're saying and I've spent a great deal of time reflecting on their feedback and what they've expressed to me in regards to their preferences with decision making and leadership expectations. And while it may be different from how I would naturally choose to operate, I am willing to consider their suggestions and I hope that they will consider mine as well. So then on that note, I would let them know that I would like to send them a survey later that week to gain their input. And I would explain my reasoning for this, of why it's so important for me, what my thinking is behind that, what the information out there is on the value of gaining this feedback. And I would make the survey as simple and streamlined as possible. So like I said before in my previous slide, any multiple choice answers and just getting it to the heart of what matters so that I'm not just overwhelming them with a survey that they have to fill out. And then I would review their input and integrate it into the development of a draft philosophy statement, which I would then email out to them in advance of the next meeting so that they have the opportunity to just review it and kind of just begin to formulate their thoughts about it. And then at the next meeting, I'd like to set up some parameters around the discussion to make sure everyone's voices are heard, but everyone's time is respected and there's a structure to it. It doesn't feel too wide open and just loose to where people don't feel like anything productive is happening. So I would propose that each team member be able to express at least one point of feedback regarding their thoughts on the drafted statement. And if the consensus is not reached by the end of the meeting, I would ask the committee to vote on whether they would, 1, prefer to table a discussion as a whole group to the next week, 2, if any particularly concerned members want to meet with me as a smaller group to revise the statement, or 3, if they would prefer me to make an executive decision and revise the statement myself for potential approval at the next committee meeting. And again, this is just, even if they voted for number 3, this is just me revising a draft statement again, for the committee to approve as a whole. So to me, that is still very much collaborating. And then I would propose that this process would be repeated for the development of the vision statement. I would also reach out to the superintendent and Board of Education and urge them to seek community input prior to the approval of those statements. And I would lay out my reasoning for this in that email because I don't think that they would, I wouldn't assume they would necessarily automatically see the value and purpose behind doing this. And then as far as thinking about, if this doesn't go the way I think it will, I do anticipate that the committee will be receptive to my proposal for how to go about developing these statements. However, I will be open to their feedback and will further reconsider my plan of action if needed, because after all, you cannot force others' contribution in a meaningful way, which is the entire purpose behind what we would be trying to accomplish in this scenario.